It was the kind of moment that no training, no manual, no captain's command could ever prepare you for. The ocean burned with fire that night. The air was thick with smoke and panic. Men shouted for help. Alarms screamed through the steel corridors. And somewhere deep in the chaos, one young sailor came up with an idea so ridiculous, so impossible, that even his own crewmates thought he lost his mind. They called it stupid. They called it hopeless. But in the end, it saved an entire aircraft carrier from sinking into the Pacific. This is the story of how one sailor, armed with nothing but buckets, desperation, and the refusal to quit, turned the tide on disaster. The year was 1945. The Pacific War had reached its brutal final stages. Kamikaze attacks, those terrifying, deliberate crashes by Japanese pilots, had become a near daily nightmare for American ships. These weren't random strikes anymore. They were precise, organized, and devastatingly effective. A single hit could tear through thick steel, ignite aviation fuel, and send a carrier, the pride of the fleet, to the ocean floor in minutes. By this point in the war, the U.S. Navy had already lost ships to these suicide missions. The crews knew what was coming each time the sirens wailed. The cry of bogey incoming meant only one thing: brace for impact. And yet, no one ever truly got used to it. One of those ships was the USS Bunker Hill, a proud Essex-class aircraft carrier that had seen battle after battle. From Leyte Gulf to Iwo Jima, she was a floating fortress, carrying over 2,600 men and dozens of aircraft. Her decks were alive with energy, engines roaring, propellers spinning, men running to refuel, rearm, and launch planes that will shape the war's final outcome. On the morning of the 11th of May 1945, off the coast of Okinawa, the Bunker Hill's crew woke to a sky that looked deceptively calm. The sea shimmered beneath the sun, and for a moment, everything felt almost peaceful. But above the clouds, Japanese pilots were already on their way, part of a massive, coordinated kamikaze attack that would hit multiple ships across the fleet. At 10:04 a.m., the first Zero appeared diving fast, barely visible until it was too late. The alarm sounded across the ship. Gunners scrambled. Some men had seconds to aim before the plane slammed directly into the flight deck, its fuel and explosives igniting everything in sight. The explosion tore through the hangar, setting aircraft ablaze and hurling debris across the deck. Then came the second plane. Less than 30 seconds later, it crashed into almost the exact same spot. The impact was catastrophic. Dozens of men were killed instantly. Jet fuel poured into the ship's lower decks, feeding a fire so intense that steel beams began to warp. Thick black smoke billowed from the carrier, choking the air and blinding anyone who tried to see through it. Entire sections of the ship were on fire. Ammunition stores were cooking off like deadly fireworks, and deep inside, water began to rushing through ruptured hull plates. The USS Bunker Hill, once the pride of the fleet, was now fighting for her life. Down in the lower compartments, ordinary sailors who weren't even trained firefighters suddenly found themselves trying to stop the Pacific Ocean from swallowing their ship. Pumps were failing, power was flickering. The command structure was in chaos. Everyone was shouting different orders, trying to make sense of what was happening as the deck tilted under their feet. And somewhere in that chaos, in the smoke, heat, and panic, one young sailor realized something horrifying. If they didn't stop the flooding in the next few minutes, it wouldn't matter how many fires they put out. The ship would roll over and sink. The problem was, every pump they had was either destroyed, jammed, or without power. The engine room was flooded. The backup systems were gone. It was just men, ankle deep and rising in oily seawater, staring at the impossible. That's when he spoke up, the sailor whose name history almost forgot. He said something so absurd, so completely outside protocol, that the others thought he was joking. He said, "Grab buckets, start bailing." Buckets on an aircraft carrier. Some of the men laughed, others yelled at him, said he was wasting time, that this wasn't some rowboat you could save by scooping water out by hand. But this sailor didn't care. He'd seen what happened to ships that waited for orders. that froze in shock or panic. He wasn't going to let that happen here. So he grabbed a bucket, just a simple metal bucket used for cleaning and fuel, and started scooping. One bucket of seawater at a time, then another sailor joined him, then another. Before long, a whole line of men formed, passing buckets back and forth in an unbroken rhythm through the smoke-filled corridor. They knew it was ridiculous, but they also knew the alternative, sitting there doing nothing while the ship sank, was far worse. Above them, fire still raged. Explosions rocked the deck. The captain was trying to steer what remained of the ship, desperate to keep her upright as smoke poured from her hull like a volcano. The air was thick with burning aviation fuel and melted paint. The heat was unbearable. And yet, below deck, these men, led by one stubborn sailor's idiotic idea, refused to stop. The bucket brigade became the heart of the ship's survival effort. They baled water from flooded compartments, passing it hand to hand through lines of exhausted men until someone could dump it overboard or redirect it away from vital systems. Every minute they fought back the sea, they bought precious time for others to contain the fires above. No one knew if it would work. No one expected it to. But somehow, it did. Through the roar of flames and the chaos of battle, this insane, improvised act of courage started making a difference. The water level stopped rising. The flooding slowed. The carrier, though battered, broken, and on fire, stayed afloat. By the time the flames were finally under control, more than 350 men were dead, hundreds wounded. But the USS Bunker Hill did not sink. She stayed alive thanks, in part, to one young sailor and his ridiculous bucket idea that turned out to be not so ridiculous after all. In the days that followed, word of the incident spread across the fleet. Officers dismissed it as a minor anecdote, but the crew knew better. They knew that when everything failed, technology, systems, command, it was human determination, sweat, and raw will that saved their ship. That sailor's name would fade into history, mentioned only in passing in after-action reports. But the story of what he did became a quiet legend among those who served on the Bunker Hill, a reminder that even in the most advanced war machine on Earth, sometimes the simplest idea can be the one that saves everything. But that's only the beginning, because what happened next in the aftermath of that kamikaze attack would reveal the full, brutal truth of what it meant to survive on a burning aircraft carrier at the end of World War II, and how one man's quick thinking shaped the rescue effort that defied every expectation. When dawn finally broke over the Pacific the next morning, the USS Bunker Hill looked more like a floating wreck than a warship. Her deck was twisted and blackened. 2 of her hangars were gutted. The smell of burned aviation fuel hung in the air, so strong that men said it coated the back of their throats. The sea around her shimmered with oil and debris fragments of aircraft, torn helmets, pieces of flight deck plating, but she was still afloat, barely, and that was all that mattered. In the hours after the kamikaze strike, the survivors worked like machines. Their uniforms were soaked in sweat and fuel, their hands raw from hauling hoses, buckets, and debris. Every man on board knew that if they stopped even for a few minutes, the ship might not make it through the night. The bucket line kept going long after the fires had been declared under control. Some sailors took turns with coffee cups, helmets, even mess trays, anything that could hold water. They passed them down blackened corridors, lit only by the flicker of burning metal and the faint glow of emergency lamps. They bailed until their arms gave out, until their skin blistered from the heat, and slowly, miraculously, the lower decks began to dry. When engineers finally made it to the flooded compartments, they were stunned. The damage was catastrophic, but the ship's buoyancy was just enough to hold. The idiotic bucket effort had kept the most critical systems, including the engines and power generators, above the flooding line. Had the water risen just another few inches, the generators would have shorted out, and the Bunker Hill would have lost all power. No pumps, no communications, no steering, nothing but darkness and rising water. Instead, because of that absurd bucket line, she lived. But survival came at a terrible cost. Over 350 men were dead. Another 200 were injured, some burned beyond recognition. For many of the survivors, the hardest part wasn't the injuries. It was the silence that came afterward. The sound of the waves slapping against the hull, the eerie calm after hours of chaos. That's when the full weight of it all hit them, the smell of burned uniforms, the faces missing from the mess hall, the empty bunks below deck. Sailors who had fought the fire side by side now found themselves attending to the dead. They built makeshift stretchers from aircraft panels, carrying bodies to the hangar bay, covering them with blankets. The chaplain moved among them quietly, saying prayers that were drowned out by the soft hum of generators. Every man knew this ship was lucky to still exist at all. It's easy to think of an aircraft carrier as indestructible, a floating fortress of steel. But the truth is, they were incredibly fragile in certain ways. Their flight decks were covered in wooden planks to make them lighter. Beneath that wood ran fuel lines, bombs, and ammunition stores. One hit in the wrong place could turn the whole ship into a firestorm. That's exactly what the Kamikaze pilots understood. They aimed not just for the ship, but for its heart, the hangars and fuel stores, knowing that one explosion could do more damage than any torpedo. What happened aboard the Bunker Hill became a case study in both disaster and survival. When the after-action reports reached Naval headquarters, commanders couldn't believe how close she had come to sinking. One officer reportedly said, "She stayed afloat by nothing short of a miracle and a few buckets." Of course, no one officially credited the sailor or the crew who started that bucket line. In the paperwork, it was simply described as damage control efforts under manual operation. But among the men, that story spread like wildfire. They joked that the ship had been saved by the world's most stubborn janitor, a sailor who refused to let the Pacific win. In the following days, the crew began patching holes, sealing off flooded compartments, and clearing the flight deck. There was no thought of launching planes anymore. The Bunker Hill was finished as a fighting ship. Her mission now was simple: stay alive long enough to limp back to safety. Other ships came to her aid, destroyers and cruisers forming a protective circle. Medics were ferried aboard to treat the wounded. The scene was like something out of a nightmare. Melted steel, shattered glass, bodies covered with oil. And yet, amid all of it, the carrier floated, steady, as though defying the ocean itself. Many sailors from other ships came aboard and stared in disbelief. They couldn't understand how she was still above water. To them, it looked like a miracle, a ghost ship still breathing. When they heard about the bucket line, they laughed at first, then shook their heads. "You guys are crazy," one destroyer crewman said. But it worked. What's even more fascinating is how moments like these changed the way the Navy approached damage control forever. Before incidents like the Bunker Hill and others, most sailors weren't trained to handle severe internal flooding or massive fires. The assumption was that technology and systems would handle it. But this event proved otherwise, that in the chaos of war, when systems fail and orders break down, human improvisation is the only thing that keeps the ship alive. After the war, new protocols were written encouraging every sailor, not just engineers, to learn the basics of damage control. Buckets were even kept as backup tools in some compartments, a quiet nod to the men who refused to let their ship sink. But the most haunting detail of all came years later. When veterans of the Bunker Hill met for reunions, they always talked about that moment, the instant when one man picked up a bucket and started scooping water like a madman. Some of them said they still heard the sound of it, the splash, the scrape of metal against the deck, the rhythm of men working in the dark. That sound, they said, was what hope felt like. And the sailor himself? His name surfaced briefly in a few testimonies. Seaman Second Class, Robert R. Larkin. He wasn't a hero in the official reports. He didn't get a medal. But to the men who were there, he was the reason they lived to tell the story. One even said, "When everyone else froze, Larkin moved, and we followed." It's those kinds of moments that define real heroism, not medals, not ranks, but instinct and courage in the face of impossible odds. And the chaos of war, that's often what makes the difference between life and death. As the Bunker Hill slowly made her way back to port, escorted by half the Pacific Fleet, sailors stood on her battered deck and looked out over the sea that had almost taken them. Many of them didn't say a word. There was nothing left to say. They just watched the waves roll by, knowing that beneath those waters lay the wrecks of countless ships that hadn't been as lucky. They didn't know it then, but the Bunker Hill would never fight again. She would spend the rest of her days as a silent reminder, a monument to sacrifice, and to one ridiculous idea that worked when nothing else did. But the story doesn't end there, because what happened when she finally reached safety would become one of the most emotional moments of the entire Pacific War. A moment that revealed the true cost of survival and how a crew forever changed by fire and loss carried the weight of that day for the rest of their lives. When the USS Bunker Hill finally limped into port, she looked like a ghost from another world. Her once proud hull was twisted and scarred, her flight deck a charred skeleton of burned timber and melted steel. Smoke still rose faintly from cracks in the deck, even days later. The ship that had once launched hundreds of aircraft into battle was now silent, wounded, and barely alive. Tugs guided her slowly into the harbor. Men stood along the rails in stunned silence, watching as rescue crews and medical teams came aboard. For the first time since the attack, they could breathe without smoke in their lungs. Some cried openly. Others simply stared at the sea as if trying to understand why they were still here when so many of their friends weren't. The harbor workers stopped what they were doing and just watched. They'd seen damaged ships before, cruisers, destroyers, even other carriers, but never anything like this. The Bunker Hill was more ruin than vessel, a floating tomb held together by sheer willpower, and the whispers spread quickly through the dockyards. That ship shouldn't be floating, yet somehow it was. As rescue crews began unloading the wounded, officers walked the decks, inspecting what was left. The heat had been so intense that even parts of the steel deck plating had softened. Bomb fragments were fused into the ship's structure. Airplane engines were buried in twisted wreckage. And below deck, in the very compartments that had been filled with water, investigators found something astonishing in those same buckets, dented and blackened, still lying where the men had dropped them. Silent proof of the fight that had taken place in the dark. Some of the crew took one look at them and broke down. It wasn't just a memory of survival. It was a reminder of everything they'd lost and everything they'd fought to keep alive. In the days that followed, Navy photographers documented the damage in detailed rows of burned out planes, melted bulkheads, twisted pipes. These photos would later become some of the most haunting images of the Pacific War. But behind every picture was a story of men who refused to abandon ship, who fought the ocean with their bare hands. Officially, the Navy listed the Bunker Hill as heavily damaged and unfit for further combat. She was sent back to the United States for repairs, but she would never return to active duty. Her war was over. Still, she had done something few ships in history had managed. She had taken not one, but 2 direct kamikaze hits and stayed afloat. When the crew finally returned home, many were sent on leave or reassigned to other ships. Some never talked about what happened. Others told the story quietly to anyone who listened. The explosions, the fire, the smell of burning fuel, and that ridiculous, unbelievable bucket line that somehow kept them all alive. One veteran later wrote in his diary, "When everything went black and we thought the ship was done, there was one guy still bailing. I don't even remember his name at first, just that he kept going. And when we saw him, we all started moving again. Maybe that's what saved us." It's a strange thing about war, how sometimes the simplest act done in panic or faith or sheer defiance becomes the line between disaster and survival. The story of that bucket brigade spread through the fleet like a quiet legend. Not a headline, not a decorated moment, just a whispered reminder of what courage really looks like. Years later, when the war was long over, the Bunker Hill's crew held reunions. The men were older now, gray-haired and slower, but when they gathered, they still talked about that day. They laughed about the absurdity of it, how they'd used cleaning buckets to fight the Pacific Ocean, but the laughter always faded into silence. Because they remembered the ones who didn't make it. They remembered the smoke, the fire, the feeling of standing on a ship they thought was dying and realizing it was still alive. At one reunion, a surviving officer reportedly brought one of those original buckets, rusted, dented, half melted, as a kind of trophy. He placed it on the table and said quietly, "This saved more men than any gun we had that day." No one argued. For the US Navy, the lessons of the Bunker Hill would last for generations. It wasn't just about better armor or faster damage control systems. It was about human instinct, the power of quick thinking, and the courage to act when everything else failed. Future carrier designs included improved fire barriers, reinforced decks, and more redundant pump systems, all inspired by ships like hers that had nearly gone under. But the truth behind this story isn't just technical. It's human. It's about one young sailor, Robert R. Larkin, who looked around at chaos and decided to try something everyone else thought was pointless. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't think about what was supposed to work. He just did something. And because of that, hundreds of lives were spared. When asked years later why he did it, Larkin reportedly said, "I figured if I was going down, I might as well go down fighting." Simple words, but in them lived the spirit of an entire generation, men who faced impossible odds and refused to surrender. The USS Bunker Hill was eventually decommissioned and scrapped in 1973. Her remains were sold for metal, her story buried beneath the noise of history. But for those who know, she stands as a symbol not of destruction, but of defiance. Of what happens when ordinary people do something extraordinary in the face of disaster. If you visit naval museums today, you might find her name engraved on plaques or mentioned in history books. But what most visitors don't know is that somewhere in the archives, tucked between faded photos and reports, there's a simple note written by a crewman saved by buckets. 3 words, that's all. And yet those words capture everything about what made that moment and that generation so remarkable. Because sometimes the difference between sinking and surviving isn't genius or strategy or luck. It's the willingness to pick up a bucket when everyone else gives up. To fight the flood, to try even when it seems insane. That's what happened aboard the USS Bunker Hill. That's how one sailor's idiotic idea became a miracle of human will. And that's why, even today, long after the guns have gone silent and the sea has reclaimed its calm, her story still echoes a reminder that courage often looks foolish until it works.